So with that, I think we're ready to begin. I'm pleased to join this morning with Dan to welcome everyone to the joint NEBI and RSM leadership event. My name is Susan Lane, and I serve as the Senior Director for Policy and Research at NEBI, and as stand-in when Michael is en route to an event. And usually when I do this, he swings in right about now. So he's en route from the State House, so I wanted to just join on behalf of NEBI and welcome everyone and say how pleased we are to be in partnership again with RSM. As you know, many of you, NEBI's been in existence for over 60 years and founded by the governors of New England for the sole purposes of doing collaborative and cross-state leadership, professional development, and any kind of sharing of resources. So this has been right in our wheelhouse, and we're pleased to have everyone joining us, those who travel short distance and those who travel from afar, so thank you. Today's discussion, both in its being dynamic and unfortunately quite timely, and I think that we will be, through the support of our panelists, will be able to explore in a little bit more detail what those new models are for strategic alliances in higher ed. I also wanted to take this opportunity to identify and recognize some of the NEBI board members who are here today. Dan Egan, Michael Alexander, Kevin Quigley, and Michelle Perkins. So without that, now I'll turn it over to you, Dan, and thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is this close enough? Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you. My name is Dan Barnett. I'm a partner with RSM here in Boston. I actually lead our higher education practice for the Northeast region, which covers everything from Philadelphia to Bangor and sort of everywhere in between. For those of you who don't know about RSM, we are the 5th largest professional services firm in the United States, 6th largest professional services firm in the world. In Boston, we're also the 5th largest firm in this market, and we have actually more than 700 people in our office under this roof. So on behalf of myself and my fellow partners, we appreciate you taking the time to come in today, and want to thank the folks at NEBI for continuing our partnership. I think this is it's either the 6th or 7th year that we partnered together on what we try to identify as timely topics, and I think frankly for 6 out of the last 7 years the focus has been to some degree on fiscal sustainability. We focused on things like measuring of academic margin, looking at ways to identify revenue enhancements, public-private partnerships, and a number of other different similar but related topics. So the topic today, that we'll have 2 panels. There'll be one before lunch, we'll break for lunch, and then one after. The 2 panels that we'll have today will focus on sort of the next phase of fiscal sustainability and mergers and acquisitions and strategic partnerships. So I'm happy to be joined on my panel this morning, if I can find my paperwork, which appears to have moved on me. I am joined this morning by, here we go, the bios are included in the packages that are provided for everybody, but Samantha Fisher, who's the Vice President with E&Y Parthenon, located here in Boston. Michael Goldstein, Senior Counsel with Cooley LLP, and Michael Horowitz, who's the President of TCS Education System. So I guess what we intend this to be is as interactive as possible. Our panelists, we've got a number of questions, but certainly offer the audience the opportunity to ask questions throughout, and there will be a period of Q&A at the end. So Samantha has a presentation which she has set up to kick things off. So Samantha, if you'd like to lead us.
Sure. Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I am the consultant on the panel, so by nature I have to put the slides up, so thanks for that. We just wanted to be able to start off by describing a little bit of the landscape as we have seen it in our research in terms of mergers and acquisitions and strategic alliances. So the first thing is that as we all know, particularly those of us in this room, smaller institutions have felt a disproportionate impact of increased competition in the higher education market most acutely, right? So on the left-hand side, you see the number of institutions by size in the market as a whole. So most institutions have under 5,000 students enrolled. And you can make that cutoff in different places, but the reality is there are very few mega institutions with more than 10,000 students at them. So most institutions are small. And those institutions with fewer than 5,000 students enrolled have seen disproportionate decreases in enrollment. So what we're finding is that small institutions are much more affected by cyclical trends within higher education, which is predominantly affected by changes in unemployment rate. And so you'll see in times of low unemployment, institutions tend to lose enrollment as they're doing now and today, and in times of higher unemployment, you start to see a disproportionate spike among smaller institutions as well. And so in this environment, institutions are looking at a number of options to try to address some of the challenges of having this more cyclical nature to their enrollment, particularly because a lot of these smaller institutions are very tuition dependent. And there's a number of different things that institutions are looking at. So you can have non-institutional partnerships, which have been around for a long time and aren't necessarily new topics for discussion today. So things like outsourcing of things like janitorial services and dining and so on. There's public-private partnerships, which we have seen a large uptick in recently. And there's more partnerships with industry as well. So research partnerships for foundations and innovation centers, excuse me, and other kinds of partnerships with industry. On the institutional side, there's a variety of different partnerships that have been taking place as well, including administrative or back office partnerships, so sharing of resources or potentially sharing of functions. So it could be things like public safety, it could be things like health and wellness. So institutions that are generally proximate could be sharing some of these services to the population. And consortia, so there's another model where institutions retain their independence but share a number of different processes. One of the biggest things that institutions will share is procurement processes to get better buying power. And then lastly, which is the most of what we'll be talking about, is combinations. And so we're very purposefully not calling it mergers at this point, but combinations, because there's a variety of different structures that these combinations can take, both in the public as well as in the private sphere. And what we've seen is that the current decade is on pace to have over twice as many mergers and consolidations in higher education than in the prior decade. So you can see this chart is how many consolidations or mergers we've found since the year 2000 up through 2017. So these are mergers that were announced in 2017, and some of them have and some of them haven't closed yet, so we'll update it again in 2018. But there's been a marked uptick in this merger activity, not only in conversations like the one we're having today, but also in reality and in the news. So what do these look like? So what we see is that 75% of mergers take place with at least one, what we're calling niche institution. So that would be an institution that has a strong focus on a particular kind of educational niche, whether that be arts or law or education. And we're also terming religious institutions as being a niche, right? So that religion in itself, we're calling a niche, because that is the largest niche that has happened, that has had mergers happen to it over the period since the year 2000. So, and who do these niche institutions merge with? Well, for the most part, they merge with larger institutions. So either very large institutions, large or medium. Rarely do they merge with small institutions, with the exception of religious institutions, which merge with each other, irrespective of size. So it's more of a mission-oriented slant to how they're merging. And that can indicate that there's a lot of synergy to be had with a smaller institution merging with a larger institution and seeking those synergies in some of the back office processes and compliance processes that, as we all know, are taking up a lot of our attention and cost recently. So that was just a bit of an overview just to say what we're seeing in the marketplace, but I don't want to monopolize this conversation. I just wanted to sort of set the stage and happy to answer questions as we move forward.
So I think the first question, it's sort of, you effectively set the groundwork for it, but it's really, so the landscape today and how it's changing and developing, I think Moody's report over the last 3 or 4 years continues to predict, dire results in terms of the number of institutions that will fail, in the coming decade. So the question is, the landscape today, how do you see it as changing and developing? And do you feel like we've reached a new point in that broader discussion about sort of next generation or the next phase of higher education?
Well, the demise of higher education institutions has been predicted now for 30 years, really, ever since the advent of the internet. It was the assumption that all of you should not be here. Massive failure of nonprofit institutions has been predicted at least since the turn of the century. I think the graphic that you just had is very illuminating. We're talking single digits. We're talking under 100 institutions out of, I think, something a little bit south of 3,000 nonprofit institutions in the country. So we're not exactly facing a tsunami. But I think the important thing is that hides the fact that there's a great number of institutions, particularly small, intermediate-sized institutions, that they're not at the edge of the cliff, but they see the cliff, and they don't know what to do about it. So they're inexorably moving in that direction. And I don't think we have a lemming phenomenon, but I think there is, in fact, a need for a wake-up call that the landscape is changing and institutions need to be intelligent about what they do when they see a need to do something other than keeping on doing exactly what they've been doing for the last how many decades or centuries. So I think this is, on the one hand, you look at that chart and say, oh, hell, 100 schools the last decade, it's not us. There is an us, and it's hidden under the surface because those are the ones who did something. And it doesn't talk about the ones who failed, which also, by the way, is a very small number, but it's there. And that's the key thing that this conversation needs to focus about. What do you do intelligently?
Take it all, okay. Is that my cue? You guys have set a pretty grim table here, so I hope to get you guys smiling. I'm a college president, so presidents have been called paid optimists. I think it can be great times for small or medium-sized colleges if there's bold leadership. So I'm the president of TCS. We're the community solution in higher education. We're a nonprofit system of 5 independent colleges. So we're not about mergers, and I wouldn't even say combinations. We built a true nonprofit system. All of our colleges, we have 5, are independently accredited, have their own president and leadership teams, faculty, board of trustees. I'll tell you a little, presidents also, I guess, tell stories. So instead of slides, I'll tell stories. I came to the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in 2000 as president. We had 200 students. So I spent 18 months, exploring mergers if I couldn't figure out how to grow the institution. And over 10 years, we grew to 3,500 students and had opened a second campus in Los Angeles. I figured out how to be the best in our space, which was professional education and the behavioral sciences. I also saw that everyone talks about being connected to community, but few colleges really embrace their community in offering their education. And as I talked to colleagues in education, in law, in business, I heard some of those same critiques. And even at 3,500 students, I never felt completely secure as a small tuition dependent institution. So my thought in 2009, and I had a courageous board that went with me, was to create TCS and offer this idea of a nonprofit system of colleges, committed to high student outcomes, another thing that is talked about a lot, but I think if that's where your main commitment is, you have to double and triple down on that, and community impact. It's been interesting to come to Boston, hear a little bit on the margins about Wheelock College. Our second college, Pacific Oaks College, is kind of the Wheelock of the West, and in 2008, their president said, we're shutting down, can't make it work. Today, its enrollment has tripled. They bought their campus. They've opened a satellite campus in the northern part of California, and they have 300 students online. So our model, which is a nonprofit supporting organization, supporting other nonprofits, has been used a lot in healthcare. I think there's a lot of commitment to not cooperating and silos in higher ed that is preventing this from taking hold. But I think we've put out a model that can offer a lot of hope and success for small and medium-sized institutions. The part I agree with both Samantha and Mike, scale is the issue today. So most small institutions can't scale on their own. Our biggest institution is 4,500 students. Our smallest is 200. But this past year, we educated over 9,000 students collectively. So whether it's finance, marketing, about 10 areas that we share in common from a system perspective. I'll tell you though that there is great intangible power in forming a community of educators. So our smallest institution, the Santa Barbara Ventura Colleges of Law, will launch the first hybrid JD in the state of California this fall. And in a million years, a school that size would not have had the resources to develop an online legal program. Most bigger law schools have not done that. So I'll stop there and hopefully get some of you smiling.
Yeah, let me make an observation in terms of what Michael has explained. And I think the TCSCS model is a brilliant model. But what's really important here is one of your states has the motto, live free or die. And in higher education, there is increasingly this notion, merge or die. It's not a polar decision. There are a lot of options. And the chart that went up before, the use of consortia, of institutional arrangements that share services, there's an increasing range of options that institutions that see their present path not being viable need to explore. But we've got to get out of this mindset that we have to merge or we're going to die. Because that so limits your ability to determine what is in fact the best course, that you're losing sight of the range of options. And if the merger doesn't work, we had an example here literally a few weeks ago, pull the plug and vanish in a puff of smoke. That probably didn't need to happen. But you march down a path, and it's very, very difficult to stop marching down that path if you don't see alternatives. So the number one issue is what is the range of options? And again, TCSCS is one extraordinarily interesting option. It's one of many, but it's a very, very useful way to think about what we're looking at here. A lot of this is mindset. A lot of this is not law. A lot of this is not money. It's mindset.
And just to add to that, it's not also just merge or die, but I think a lot of institutions view it as I'm only going to think about merger if I'm about to die. And what we actually see in the marketplace is over 60% of merging institutions, or there's two sides to this, right? There's especially if you're talking about a small and a large institution, there might be someone with financial distress, but over 60% of institutions who undertake mergers are doing it without any stated financial distress. And so to build on Michael's point as well, on scale, it's a sort of a corporate strategy of inorganic growth, right? The market is flat, enrollment is flat in higher education right now. It's difficult to grow enrollments organically. So how can we achieve scale? And one of the ways to achieve scale is to partner in some fashion. And you can do that well in advance of seeing death right around the corner, right? So there's other reasons to explore merger, and a lot of successful mergers have taken other reasons. And moreover, having those reasons, when you talk to regulators, when you talk to the market, when you go put out a press release, it's good for the whole institution to get behind something positive. That is not, we're doing this because otherwise we'll have to close our institution, right? But there's some real good strategic reasons for why you have chose a particular partner, and those are positive, and you actually prefer to move forward with those irrespective of the financial situation, but just happy to be able to move forward in a positive direction for the institution.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Death's door is not a good place to plan or strategize. The most dramatic conversation I had was a call from one president who said, I don't think we can make payroll next week. And I said, I wish you'd called me a year earlier, because I thought his institution could have been a good fit for us. We in our model, all the financial assets pretty much remain at the colleges, and we're not in a position to really financially invest. So there has to be something on the table. But there can be deficits. Again, going back to Pacific Oaks, they were running a significant deficit, but they had reserves, they had real estate. More importantly, they had 70 years of history as being known as a leader in early childhood education. The other thing I think we've proven out is our easternmost campus is in Washington, D.C. We have a number in California. Of course, we're in Chicago, and we're also now in Dallas. And so, in some ways, lack of geographical proximity is very positive, because people kind of can establish their lanes. And I think we've shown that through the use of technology, you can tie together institutions that are all over the country, maybe even all over the world.
I think there's an interesting distinction here. We all know about online program managers, and very, very successful. 2U is probably the poster child for that. You're essentially outsourcing your online activities. There was a notion a few years ago that if an institution went online, it was going to be fat and happy and never have to worry about money again. Not so much. It does represent an opportunity for some institutions, and using a third party like an online manager certainly saves huge capital costs in setting up such a program. And we work with a lot of OPMs, we work with a lot of institutions working with OPMs. But again, that's a model. TCSCS is a different model. TCSCS is a comprehensive service provider to a group of dissimilar institutions. It's a completely different model. And I think the importance here is to identify, what are you missing? What would give a basis to sustain the mission of the institution? And just a moment on that point. The hardest thing for this institution to do is to recognize that its mission is the higher education version of the buggy whip. And Sweetbriar is a very good example of an institution that did not have money problems. But the board decided our mission wasn't viable. We really didn't see a future for the institution doing what it was doing. So they decided, we'll make a very orderly, slow close down. It didn't close because institutions have something that is totally unique in American business. They're called alumni. And they don't really take very well to being told, by the way, your institution's not going to be there anymore. And that's what reversed it. It didn't change the mission issue. But the issue of can we sustain the mission? Should we sustain the mission? Should we change the mission? Do we do that by aligning with someone else, either as in a TCSES model or in other models? But those are the questions that have to be asked. It's a very complicated process. It's a multivariate process. And having been a board member of several institutions, a board chair of a university out in California, university administrator, I've seen all this firsthand, and I've seen the inability or the difficulty in focusing on the alternatives. And that is the most important takeaway from this kind of conversation. You've got to think wide, because the options, the alternatives, it's not merge or. It's merger as an option among options.
So I'd like to explore a little bit. So I've seen consortia work. So I'm a Worcester guy, lifelong, and there's 11 college universities in Worcester. And that consortium existed for a period of time. But when I talked to the people at those schools, those institutions, the consortium was never effective in a lot of ways to do things jointly. You could take consortium classes coming from one to the other, but in terms of like shared services or benefit of shared services, there wasn't a whole lot of that was very effective. To the contrary, you've got the consortium of the schools of the Fenway here, which seem to work much more collaboratively in a number of different areas. So I see that as a consortium model where you try to do things jointly. The TCS model is different, and I think that it's certainly unique to me, and I've spent 28 years in the game. So maybe if you could expand a little bit on how, as the accounting geek in the room, I'm going to ask an accounting question. It says, are you, for financial statement purposes, are you a single entity, or are each of the entities standalone, separately audited? It's a model I'm not used to seeing. So I'd like to.
It's a great question, and I'm often asked if we're a consortium, and the answer is no. We have some similarities. To my mind, consortium, can have some benefits. It's nibbling around the edges, and our desire was to create a true nonprofit system. I've never worked in the public university space, but you might think of the TCS system office like a central office of a state university system. And actually, Dan and I never met before today, but I'll disclose that RSM is the auditor for all 5 of our colleges and for TCS. And so no, in fact, each college has its own financial audit, its own Title IV audit, and then there is a consolidated audit. We also have to do a third-party service provider auditor. That's the only one we don't use RSM for, because in some cases we're considered to have that status. Again, we have about 10 or 11 central services that we provide. Being a nonprofit system, when a college joins us, they become part of the leadership of TCS. So unlike an OPM, we don't have to do things this way forevermore. And in fact, we've centralized, a few years ago, we had decentralized IT, and the college president said, we don't like this, because you take the whole thing. So in most cases, the same IT personnel stayed at the college campus. Now their paycheck came from TCS, and they were reporting in to one structure. We have a chief operating officer that decentralized the online admissions process, because it was her insight that people were starting to fight over online or ground student. Just let the colleges run that and figure out the best way. I'll tell you the great advantage of the combination is, so we were contacted out of the blue by the DOE that said, you can just send the consolidated audit now on behalf of all 5 colleges. So we went to 3.0, across the board on our financial score. And it's an all-in model, because everyone gets excited about, can we have the marketing, or can we have the benefits? We have a great HR, retirement and employee benefit program. And unlike a consortium, it's all in, because we think it breaks down the capacity to scale if we do an a la carte menu. And as I said, we don't lead with the shared services are a benefit, but we really promote this idea of it has to start with the mission, the commitment to student outcomes and to community impact. And so you join through an affiliation agreement. We're the sole member, TCS becomes the sole member of each nonprofit entity. Again, I think it's used a lot in healthcare. We've seen some religious institutions where the church might be the sole member of the college entity.
That's interesting. Before we sort of move on to next sets of questions, are there any questions from the audience, things that people might want to ask before we move forward?
Under your motto, do the institutions retain their name, or they take on the TCS name?
They retain their name. A good opportunity to tell you their names. We're the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, Pacific Oaks College and Children's School, Santa Barbara and Ventura Colleges of Law, Saybrook University, and the Dallas Nursing Institute. So again, we explicitly, in fact, I was frustrated with having such an anonymous sounding name, because we thought we'd be in the background, which we are for the most part. But one of the regional accreditors said, well, you can't be a secret, and it's a good thing, you gotta be on the website. So we're branding more heavily this idea of the community solution. Our model is about retaining the mission, the identity of the college. Overwhelmingly, the marketing, for example, is at the college level. But we've realized we need to do a little bit of TCS marketing for employees to attract, we call them new affiliates. And this year, we're about to send out something to the students at all of the colleges, just, hey, realize you're part of a bigger network. There may be opportunities to take classes, across colleges. And one of the best things we did was 2 years ago, global engagement is one of our shared services. We ran one course. We challenged the group to say, let's have one course that involves study abroad and online, and credit will be given at all 5 colleges. And we did a course on immigration, and the trip was to Berlin. We're going to do the second course this time. It was a powerful meeting, because it showed we could collaborate academically, but it forces you to confront different tuition levels, different calendars, which you all have. So the colleges on their own, they don't have to, they're agreeing to move toward a common calendar so they can have joint degrees. They're sharing gen ed courses now that are not specific to their disciplines at the bachelor's level. So not only the name, but again, independent board, independent accreditation. And in fact, we've created a great community at the trustee level. So there's roughly 60, 70 trustees across the 5 colleges in TCS. We bring them together every year, either at AGB or in the off year we run our own conference, and I think they're getting a lot out of interacting with each other.
It's an interest, let me just pursue a point on this. This is an extension of a model that has existed for a while. The Pomona College's, the Atlantic University Consortium is a very close example of very, very tight shared services, very close academic interaction with independent institutions. The difference here is that the institutions are under the ultimate legal control of TCSES, but the individual campus governance rests with the local boards, the way you structured it, the institutional boards. There's another interesting model, and economically very successful, and it's Laureate Education. And Laureate owns, I think it's now probably north of 100 institutions around the world. They have well over 1 million students. Every institution operates under its own brand, its own name, and has a local governance body, but they're owned by Laureate. Now, that's a for-profit company, but that distinction actually is not a material one here. There is a lot of shared service. There are a lot of efficiencies of scale. And the notion of a different kind of model like that, again, there's nothing, you go back and look at some of the very successful consortia, they've done like this, but not with the same kind of structure. They've done it like Laureate. What we need to be looking at is what works for a particular institution. The other point that's very important, distinct here, is the Laureate schools say they are part of the Laureate Global Education Network. The TCSES schools increasingly are saying they're part of this community. Distinction of online program managers, other services. Nobody advertises that Pearson provides their online program or that 2U provides their online program. That's below the surface. This is above the surface. So again, it's a different kind of institutional model.
I would also say that there's a lot of models out there, right? So the consortium model that the Claremont Consortium is one that's been around for a while and is highly focused on shared services and providing a lot of services to its institutions. There's other consortia which call themselves consortia and effectively have not much more than a library sharing arrangement, which is convenient because, who wants all those books, but you share them, it's great. But it's pretty limited in that sense. And you can get everything in between for a consortia. Also, when we talk about mergers, there's a number of processes that institutions can go through. So you can have the Wheelock BU model, which is something that went from nothing to everything in the course of a year. But a number of institutions take steps that are much slower than that, moving towards merger. So if you think about NYU Poly, that was an 8-year process through a lot of legal structure changes that started off with an alliance and an investment of NYU in Poly. And the same thing with Middlebury and the Monterey Institute. It didn't start off as a merger. It started off as an alliance where they had programs that were coordinated together, that were mission-oriented. And then Middlebury found out that Monterey might need some help in terms of a financial investment, which they provided them. And then slowly over time, they became increasingly integrated until a merger was not disruptive. It was the natural next step in their alliance because they had grown together so closely. So there's a number of different models by which institutions can merge. And if we look over since the year 2000, nearly a quarter of the mergers that have taken place have migrated together slowly like that, which is something you can do, particularly if finance is not the primary driver or there's a very long financial runway to undertake that.
So I actually sit on the board for a small college here in Boston. My president is here joining me today. And we were fortunate to have engaged Parthenon probably 5 years ago, I think at this point, to help us begin to look at our sort of future state and how we get to that next generation. And I feel blessed having joined this board subsequent to the Parthenon study, but to be connected with a group of individuals who frankly are it's a tremendous board. The way that we work together sort of in a coordinated goal in this forward direction is really our saving grace at this point. But I know that's not always the case. I know there are a number of examples we could point to here in Boston where board conflicts get in the way of good governance. And I also understand, in the university world, you get the shared governance model between, the academic side and the non-academic side. What sort of hurdles have you seen in trying to evolve into these different models? And what are ways that we can try to overcome those types of
You
issues.
kind of hit right on it. I mean, it's so important to get governance strong and a great board, and for this kind of discussion and education to be continuous and not when you have troubled times. When I was at the very tiny Chicago school, we engaged the Association of Governing Boards, and they sent us a great New Englander, E.B. Wilson. I think he's retired now. I think he was board chair of various colleges here in the New England area. And it has to be continuous, and you have to bring people from the outside, whether it's experts like these two, people doing different models, because most board members don't have the background, and they're volunteers, so you have to really press it. And often, my feeling is they come with sort of naive solutions that they want to translate from their own background. So that has to be done right, or nothing will happen. And that's really on the president, I think, overwhelmingly, to recruit great trustees and keep them engaged and educated.
Part of the issue is the fragmentation of institutions. I mean, they are not, I know this will come as something of a shock, they're not linear hierarchies. The president does not have absolute control over the institution. One of the best descriptions of the role of the president was that she had absolute control over whether or not to have sugar in her coffee in the morning, and it fell off precipitously from that. Which actually has some truth to it. The board does not have absolute control over the institution, although legally it does. Faculty does not have absolute control over the institution, although it thinks it does. And the students are actually out there and they're paying a lot of money, either directly or through incurring debt, to go to the institution. So what's needed for a successful change in structure, and I want to stay away from the word merger. It could be any one of the models. Acquisition is another term that we don't like to use, but it's there. There are a number of foreign organizations, for-profit and non-profit, that are looking to acquire institutions in the U.S. There has to be a collaboration across the institution, but it has to be an intelligent collaboration. A lot of board members don't understand the complexity of the institution, frankly. A great many faculty don't understand the financial realities of the institution. And the students typically are not terribly impressed with how anybody is running anything. And the president has to try to hold that all together. So one of the critical issues here is education. Of going into the process and explaining and getting people to understand what the goal is, what the intended outcome is, how the process will work, and get to that endpoint in a collaborative manner. It's very difficult. And I had one experience which is semi-germane to this. We know a very small institution up in southern New Hampshire, which nobody ever heard of until a few years ago, and now everyone heard of. And I was invited to go up there and talk to the board about what it would mean to bring in a substantial online program intended to serve adult learners and what the barriers were and such. And that was a turning point in that the president had a very, very clear, Paul LeBlanc had a very clear understanding of what he wanted, but his board wasn't listening very well. So, and I think all of you who are presidents understand you've got to bring in a stranger to explain to your board what you've been telling them for years. Getting that buy-in across the institution is absolutely critical. And we just had a situation working with an institution where the ability of the institution, and the institution was considering a relationship with TCSES, the ability of the institution to understand fully what TCSES was about was less than perfect, and that made that relationship a non-starter. So there is so much of this is not just in looking at the range, but in then educating your own entity and bringing in people, frankly, who can talk honestly and directly and say, look, this is the way it's worked. You are not stepping into the void. There's actually a path forward.
To build on that, I think that one of the bigger barriers, there's a series of barriers that happen through each stage of the process, right? The first barrier is getting the institution to agree that it's some partnerships or combinations or mergers or what have you is something that it should explore. And typically that requires 1 to 2 people with some kind of understanding or vision for the institution such that they want to advocate for that. And then the rest of the board and some small numbers of the leadership team, usually just confined at this point to the president and the CFO, need to come to the understanding that this is something that they want to be able to explore and why. And at this point, it doesn't have to be a commitment, right? We are going to merge, and that is what we're going to do, but something just to explore. So first coming to that understanding that there is a burning platform, either whether it be strategic or financial or what have you, that they need to start looking at that. That's the first sort of roadblock that we see. The next is, well, how to do that. So it's very much a black box for institutions. So in other industries, in the corporate sphere, there's a whole host of professional services out there that can help to facilitate the discussions in a very private way, right? Institutions don't know how to do that. Because there's this perception that if you're exploring merger type options, it must mean your institution is knocking on the door of imminent death. It seems so scary to go out there and start talking to other institutions about this particular concept, because what if this were to get into the newspaper? What if people were to find out about this? When corporations discuss mergers, it's also very impactful, but they think they can go back to being a corporation if it doesn't work out. Especially small institutions have this sense that their institution is just going to fold if the market finds out that they're exploring a merger and it doesn't work out. And why do they think that? Because it's happened before. And so sort of overcoming that fear and thinking about partnerships in a broader sense, such that more and more people are exploring the topic, even when there's no financial risk to the institution, and doing it a little bit earlier, sort of dispels some of that potential fear. And also institutions need to get onto the same page about why they're doing it in advance, right? So there's a number of questions. So first they need to know why. So it could be financial, it could be strategic. But everyone has to be on the same page as to why they want to undertake this in a positive way, as well as a realistic way. Also, why now, right? So your institution might have 1 year of runway, it might have 10 years of runway, but it doesn't mean you need to wait until year 10 to start exploring options. It could be good to go out into the marketplace to understand what your options are much earlier. So have an understanding of why now, or not now. And a clear understanding of how. So a lot of merger processes start happening with people who know other people in the industry, talking quietly to friends, and that can be really good because you could have a lot in common with people that you know very well, and or institutions that know one another really well and have had a history of cooperation, and it works out really well. It also could really limit the options. Right, so another way to undertake the process is to expand the field of options a little bit more, to talk to more players, to be able to have more choices to compare against one another. Because ultimately, any partnership requires compromise from both sides. And so if you are able to understand what your particular options are, you understand which is the best among them, as opposed to just picking out the faults in the only option that you have, which helps people to move forward a little bit in the process as well. And it helps to accelerate those conversations on a clear sort of timed process that's appropriate for your institution, because there's nothing that kills a merger faster than time. So
there's an example that we talked about very briefly, and that was New York University and what was then Polytechnic University of New York, possibly the world's worst acronym. But this is the perfect example of filling a niche. New York University had for many years a quite respectable engineering school. And in the early 70s, it sold the engineering school to City University of New York. It was in somewhat dire financial straits. City University wanted an engineering school. They sold the entire campus, the Heights campus, and gave up engineering education completely. In the 21st century, they decided, technology is probably not a really bad place for us to be. And looked around, and they said, well, we can organically regrow an engineering school at considerable cost and a lot of time. At the same time, Polytechnic University was growing at it was a distinguished engineering program, growing at a fairly slow rate, did not see its ability to leapfrog into the first ranks, and part of that was a lack of the capital needed to do that. So NYU and Poly entered into, described as a fairly long dance. And part of it was a get to know you. Part of it was very much to socialize the faculty and the boards of the two institutions. And they went from an alliance to ultimately a merger over, I think the total time was about 7 years. And at this point, very successful. Now, interestingly, it was Polytechnic Institute of New York University at the time of the merger. It is now the Tandon Institute of New York University. Why? Because Mr. Tandon gave approximately $100 million. And while there were those who said, wait, we agreed we would maintain the name, there were others who said, wait, that's $100 million. But again, it's much bigger. We're talking about a 50,000 student institution merging with a 10 or 12,000 student institution. But it filled a niche. It filled a need for both schools. And it was identifying how do you connect those pieces together that made that workable. And again, it was a slow, it was a mating of porcupines. And it worked, and it is working now. But you have to be prepared for that kind of process.
You asked a great question about faculty shared governance. I mean, again, a tough issue. I think one that can be dealt with successfully. Again, initially when we formed TCS, we did have a lot of skepticism among the faculty. Were we going to change the mission or nature because of each of our 5 colleges, distinct faculty culture? Online has helped a lot. And again, no one is forced. The only thing that our college has mandated is that every course be within the online shell, even if it was a ground course. That already helped a lot. But we now have a waiting list of faculty that want to do these 5 college courses, and so we went to a next thing of saying, any faculty from 2 of our colleges that do something together will get a grant, a collaboration grant. We have an academic assembly every year. We're starting to build a common adjunct pool, which I think will be fantastic, so that the adjuncts can be more, secure and reliable and have the higher income and be engaged with all of TCS. So over time, I would say we even have champions of the model among the faculty as they get to know each other. And really, when you join TCS, the faculty are almost least impacted because it's in all the business areas that you absolutely have to make some adjustments and trade-offs. For the most part, the faculty are protected. You need them to teach the programs, and there's further opportunity. Another cause for optimism, in my view, is this is a great time to be a not-for-profit in American higher education, however it fell out. The for-profits, I think, had some appropriate critiques early on about our lack of responsiveness to students, about not getting into new modalities. However, it came about, a lot of it crashed and burned, and I think it's going to be very hard for them to recover their brands. But that doesn't mean that you can say, well, I'm not for profit and everything's going to be great. Since you brought it up, Mike, the interesting thing with Laureate, and we partner with their institution in Peru, which is incredible. 20,000 students who say it's accredited in Peru and in the United States. In the US, though, they're either closing or selling off their institutions. The one in Chicago, they just basically gave to one of the nonprofit institutions in town. And I think, again, the difference is we feel all our institutions need to grow, we need to grow. But if they're growing 1 or 2%, if they're hitting a surplus of 4 or 5, 6%, that's fine. I think what Laureate found in this environment is they didn't have the stomach or tolerance, or they just weren't going to get the growth. And I think in a for-profit paradigm, the pressure to grow much more quickly than is sometimes wise is in play, and I think that's an important distinction.
Well, they made an intentional decision to pull out of the U.S. market. They only have one institution now in the U.S. market, Walden. They basically decided we're going to be a global institution excluding the U.S. It's an interesting market decision. The other point that I think has come up here is mergers don't always work. They're long, they're difficult, and at the end of the day you may say thank you, but it doesn't work. Mount Ida is a really good example of if the alternative to not working is death, you probably are not in a great position to negotiate a good agreement with your partner. And I think that's probably the most telling aspect of an unfortunate situation. It's not that it was a bad idea. It was way too late. And if you have a situation where one of the partners is not just teetering on the edge of the cliff, but obviously about to fall over, the other partner is going to be really, really cautious about grabbing hold, because the chance is they might get pulled over as well. So if, in fact, the analysis is a merger makes sense, there is a combination of niche, there's a filling of a gap, there is a market opportunity as an institution, there is a mission-driven connection. Don't wait until you're at the edge, because you are in the least favorable position to negotiate a transaction that works. And don't lose sight of the fact that this, at the end of the day, is a business transaction.
And to that point, we talked about the Mount Ida example, we talked about the NYU example. The question becomes, how do you identify what types of institutions would be best situated for these types of arrangements? So, in your example, if you're adding a new institution within the system, do you have your feelers out today to, a dozen different institutions that you're looking as could be good candidates? How does that process evolve?
We've tried it both ways. It's been mostly organic. People hearing about us and approaching us. I think we've talked to about 100 institutions now to get to 5. So we start with this idea, again, there has to be a commitment to community-based education in a serious way. And really, we're about high-level professions transforming students at the community level. So overwhelmingly, we're in fields such as psychology, law, nursing, preparing teachers. However, we have some of our fastest growing programs are at the baccalaureate level. So that's another reason for optimism if you can be agile. There's a growing market, even in New England, I would say, of adult students that have some college and have not completed. And many of them want to go on and become professionals with a graduate degree. So we've also you know, engaged a broker to say, you know, go and look for us. Again, it comes down to needing to have a creative and good conversation with the president and then with board members. So again, if board members are not educated, it's tough to do that. And as Mike said, you shouldn't be doing it when you're in dire straits, because in our model, since we're not really a financial answer out the gate, someone that's very struggling, an institution that doesn't have any resources at all, that we can't figure out how to make some turn with their existing resources, is not going to be a good candidate for us. I'll say that online is critical. I was really gratified. There's yet another study out showing that academic outcomes are increasingly superior in online or hybrid courses. We started online with an OPM in 2006, and like most, suffered through a 10-year contract. I've never heard of an institution signing a second 10-year contract. That's why it's 10 years. So, I mean, at that point, that's the only way we could do it. You know, my advice would be, if you can avoid it, because we thought we had a pretty good deal at giving away only half the revenue. It's really ridiculous. If colleges band together, there was an era where the idea was it's this secret black box. And that's, you know, we can't tell you what it is because we're a for-profit company. What's in the secret black box? Great instructional designers, great faculty, savvy about enrollment and marketing. So again, it may be tough for a small college to do on its own, but if you band together with 2, 3, 4, 5 other colleges, you can hire those same people.
I think the question isn't really who can be successful in a merger situation, it's who's the right partner for you. Because each situation could be different. And what we see is there are some more commonalities amongst institutions that undertake successful merger. So first and foremost, someone has to be financially secure, right? So looking at that financial and regulatory and reputational risks that you might undertake with merging with an institution are important. As particularly if you're the institution that is slightly less financially sure. If you're the institution that has some financial security and is looking to absorb, then it's a case of understanding which institution is likely to bring the highest synergies to your institution. So where are you best matched to be able to add to your mission, but also create operational synergies such that it makes financial sense for the two of you to be merged. Because two people have to find that attractive, right? So one institution you have to find it attractive together, and that means together you need to make more than the sum of your parts. In addition to that, there's some structures that are more common than others, right? So institutions tend to merge with those in their same state because the regulatory complications are fewer. They tend to merge with some kind of proximity to one another, with TCS being obviously very, very notable counterexample. They also tend to merge with similar types. So publics don't tend to merge with privates. For-profits don't tend to merge with nonprofits. There's definitely examples, right? So Purdue Kaplan being the biggest counterexample of all of that, a public having an arrangement with a for-profit. And certainly those counterexamples get a lot of press because they're counterexamples. So generally speaking, you would look to try to see what makes the most sense for you first. But there's definitely some white space out there to explore some more innovative options like that as well.
I think Purdue Kaplan is interesting. It is emphatically not a merger. It has no resemblance to a merger. It was a sale of the instructional component of Kaplan College, Kaplan University, to a new academic unit created out of Purdue University. And Kaplan now has a long-term performance-based contract as, among other things, an online program manager. But they are out of the education business. as an instructional entity. So again, it's important to distinguish. You know, people say, oh my God, Kaplan is merging with Purdue. No, very different. But what is important here, two points. One is this is not a DIY business. It is complicated. It's difficult. And you need to, and Parthenon is among the best in the business in doing the kind of data analytics that you really need to understand what you're looking at. The other point, which is critical, and this has been proven in business over and over, the merger of two failing companies inevitably results in a single larger failing company. And the worst possible outcome is two institutions that are both careening towards the cliff, and as they go over, they join hands. And there have been enough examples of that. I mean, that is, again, a piece of what you have to watch out for. If you're heading for the cliff, you know, you've got to figure out how to do something before you reach there. But if someone reaches out to you, you have to be very, very intentional in what you're grabbing hold of. And that's not a simple process. It's not a process of just looking at the financials. It's not a process of just looking at the enrollment information. It is a complicated process. But again, the merger of failing institutions has really given mergers a bad name. Because, well, they were failing, but they got together, and guess what? They failed. Okay, mergers don't work. No. And again, this is why this has so many pieces, why I think, frankly, having this kind of conversation sponsored by NEVI is so useful. Because you're not alone, and the fact that you're, you know, unclear. Again, I'm a trustee of Vermont College of Fine Arts, and very small institution up in beautiful Montpelier. I was up there this weekend, and by the way, Boston is gloriously beautiful in the spring compared to Montpelier this time of year. Snow on the ground. One of my fellow trustees is here in the audience. Understanding the complexity shouldn't be a reason to not do it. It should be a reason to be very intentional in doing it and looking broadly at the options. The point you made about most mergers are nearby, of the same type, that's true. That doesn't mean that's the model. That just means that's a model. You need to be prepared to look broadly. You need to be prepared, if there's a similar institution, something that fits across the country, that may be an easier merger than somebody across the street. You have to be willing to think broadly to make these kinds of activities work when it is in fact appropriate to the institution.
So before I move on, I have plenty of questions on the list here, but is there anything from the audience, any question that anybody would like to raise for this group? We've got, I think, about another 15 minutes before we break for lunch. So, Tony?
Thanks, Dan. I want to kind of circle back to an idea that keeps coming forward, and that is that really an institution thinking about collaboration or merger, money is somewhere in the mix, but it's not, to do it right, to do it well, to successful collaboration isn't only about money. And so I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about some of the processes that institutions have gone through to determine what is that other thing. So how does an institution say, hey, you know what, this is the thing that would really bring us into a good marriage, or this is the thing we'd be looking for in a partner?
Yeah, when we work with institutions, as part of understanding the target list of potential partners, we work with the institution to define what it is they're trying to get out of the merger and what's most important to them. And we put it in different kind of categories, depending on how necessary it is that they actually undertake some kind of cooperation, whether that be merger alliance or what have you. And the first thing is non-negotiables. So what are you not going to ever give up? It is critical to you and your board and your institution, and there's nothing that's going to make you give that up. What are the non-negotiables? Or things that you simply can't change, right? What are the nice-to-haves? Or what's sort of next on the list, and then what are the nice to haves, right? So non-negotiable, strongly desire, and nice to haves. And so you come up with this list of priorities that you're looking for to get out of it. And certainly financial solvency is on that list. But there could be a number of other different things, and that depends on the institution. So we've seen institutions put things like, we absolutely simply must retain a portion of our name going forward, and I don't care. Like, I care about that more than keeping all my faculty. Other institutions say we need to keep all of our faculty, and that is the most important thing. So it's really up to the institution to determine what the strategic priorities are, which is why it's so difficult to understand whether these mergers have actually been a success. In reality, most of those 100 mergers that we put up there haven't failed in the sense that they haven't then subsequently closed, right? A few of them have, but most haven't. But I don't know if every one of them would say that their merger was a success, right? So if maybe you want to get enrollment growth out of it, maybe you want to retain your mission, maybe you want a strong cultural match with the other institution. There could be a lot of things, but you need to know what that is before you go into it, so you know exactly what to look for. But they can't be too rigid as well, right? So if you have this long laundry list of non-negotiables, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to find another partner that wants to work with you as well, because in reality, any of these arrangements, regardless of their legal structure, require both parties to get something out of it in the long run in order for it to last long.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
I want to emphasize a point here about the non-negotiable. Nothing should be ultimately non-negotiable. You can certainly tell your advisors, this is what we want, this is what we need. We need to maintain the name, we need to maintain certain programs, we need to maintain certain identity. But don't put yourself in a box of saying, we'll never change something. I mean, the worst thing you could possibly say is, we have to protect all of our faculty. It's a nice goal. It's an admirable goal, but you may find a circumstance where it is against the best interests of the institution to pursue that. We have to maintain our name. There may be ways to preserve identity without doing that. You cannot go into the definition of negotiation is a certain level of flexibility. If you're not prepared to negotiate, don't start. You do need to draw lines. You do need to understand we're not tossing the keys across the table. That's the other side. That's the desperate institution that says, take us here. And I've seen that. And generally speaking, those keys lie on the table, untouched, unless there's some property that somebody can grab and do something with and say, just go away. But it is a merger, an alliance, all of that is a negotiation. And you may have more or less leverage, but it can be, this is what we want, and if we can't get everything we want, we're not going to talk. You're probably wasting your time, unless you have, $1 billion endowment, then you can probably tell people what you want to do.
So can you follow up on some of the comments you made about both the positive and more challenging experience with the Board of Trustees and how they've engaged in this process and how they've either amplified it or perhaps derailed it?
Well, in our model, right, the Board of Trustees has to agree and sign an affiliation agreement, and they give up 4 reserved powers. I don't know that I'll remember all 4, but we have to consent to the election of trustees. If you walked into any of our college's board meetings, you wouldn't necessarily know that they're part of the system because they choose their trustees, they elect them, we have the right to consent. We have to consent if they want to change their tax structure or bylaws, articles of incorporation. It's very light touch. Going back to Dan's question, I mean, the answers, I think, are always outside in part. So colleges can't turn inward to figure out issues. And so I think, I encourage presidents to expose trustees early on to our model. We've gone and made presentations to board members. We've invited them in to see what we're doing. We've let them sit with college board members of institutions that have joined us, so they can get a sense of the pros and cons. But you know, it's a delicate dance because they're volunteers, and you have to convince them to dig in and in our view, do the right thing. I would say, you know, it's very rewarding though to play in this, we call it radical cooperation, in this cooperative space. So going back to whether it's negotiable or not, if you think it's fun to play team sports, we're a team sport, because the presidents who join our group become part of influencing the whole. It's not a vendor relationship, it's not a one-way relationship. If your preference is bowling or golf, you know, to use, then we're not the right model.
But I think it's important.
To understand that the TCSES model, by the time a board engages, they've already crossed a major divide. They're willing to have that conversation. And there's a mechanism, a very sophisticated mechanism, that Michael and his colleagues have developed to help educate boards in that process. But in most cases, you haven't gotten there. You're looking into the void. And the question for the president is, how do I get my board to think intelligently about doing something that will go to the structure, go to the identity, go to the independence of the institution? And that is a knowledge-building exercise. I mean, it's really, really critical for the board to understand what the president is talking about if he or she is moving this forward. If the board chair comes to the president and says, why don't we merge? All the more reason why the board needs to be educated in what that means, needs to be educated in the process, have available to it the expertise to carry out that process. I mean, every institution has a college attorney, sorry. We're all members of the National Association of College University Attorneys, which is a remarkably sharing organization. Lawyers usually aren't great at sharing. College attorneys are very good at it. So if, in fact, you're interested in that kind of engagement, you have somebody there who can reach out to others and say, tell me about your experience. Tell me about how I can best train my board. Tell me how I can best deal with faculty issues and such. But board socialization to the notion of a change in identity structure, whatever you want to call it, a merger being in one version of that, is a very, very delicate process. I will guarantee you that a merger will fail if it is simply dropped on a board and say, here's what we want to do. Or even worse, if the board drops it on the institution. If you want to see a faculty with pitchforks and torches, that'll do it. So it's hard to say this, but for educational institutions, there's a really heavy educational lift that has to take place. It's not a short process. It's an iterative process, but it's really, really important.
Yeah, and engaging it continuously. I mean, I visited colleges that were not a good fit because the president said, I just want to expose the model. I spoke with Michael Thomas, actually, at the Catholic University Association. I think we could have a Catholic institution within TCS, though it's less likely, and they wanted to understand what our model was, so maybe more Catholic institutions could do something together. Increasingly, I'm a big fan of ad hoc committees on boards, and I'm seeing presidents take a small group of trustees to really be deeper and more conversant with these issues, and they're kind of the leading edge as colleges look at collaboration.
In our experience, we've seen it go both ways. So we've seen presidents who've left their institutions because their board wouldn't listen to them when they said how badly they needed to explore merger. We've seen boards who've come to presidents saying that they need to explore merger, and the presidents kind of refuse to do it because they view it as a critique on their own ability to run the institution. And we've seen boards with a lot of infighting with one another as well. So there's certain factions of the board that are really interested in exploring it, and other factions of the board that can't accept this as an option. I think the more you can slowly move towards exploration and do this education slowly so that there's no commitment In reality, there's no commitment to a merger until you sign an MOU and go public with it, right? So while there's only been 100 mergers or so over the past 17, 18 years, there's been many more explorations of merger. And usually, by the time institutions get to a merger, a lot of times they would have had merger conversations many years before that. So if you think about Wheelock, for example, David Chard, the current president, didn't even know that they had had merger conversations in like the 90s and then before in the 70s, right? So a lot of mergers happened in the 70s with the male and female sort of merging to become co-ed. So a lot of institutions have undertaken this exploration before. I think one of the biggest hurdles is moving the board past the swirl of conversation to moving towards action. Because ultimately, a conversation is nice to have once a quarter at your board meeting, but without moving towards something and actually reaching out or exploring options further and getting a process in place that you're all comfortable with moving forward with, it'll just remain at that, just a conversation.
Just one, this is another unsolicited advertisement for lawyers. Mergers are actually very complex legal agreements. The MOU is a step of the way. It is not, the deal is not done until there's a definitive agreement. It's got a lot, and I mean a lot of moving parts. It has to be done well. You need to have people who understand the process, who understand the institution, who understand the regulatory framework. I don't have to tell any of you that we are in the most highly regulated industry in America. We have more regulators than the nuclear regulatory, than a nuclear power plant. And it's critical. The thing that again, I've seen mergers torch, not because it was a bad idea, but because it wasn't done well. So it's really, really important to invest. If you're going to do it right. If you don't want to invest in doing it right, don't do it.
So that about wraps up the time for the first session this morning. So we're going to break right now for lunch. The lunch should be set up right outside. Ask you to come back in. We're going to pick it back up in about 15 minutes. But if I could get a round of applause for I had alluded in my remarks about the failure of the Worcester Consortium. And that, in fact, is correct. That was a consortium that went away about 5 years ago. There is a new consortium in Worcester, so I did not want to disparage that group. So HECMA, the Higher Education Consortium of Central Massachusetts, is the new body that replaced what formerly was the Worcester Consortium. So I did want to make sure to add that as a point of clarification. So thank you.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. On behalf of the New England Board of Higher Education, regret and apologies for not being here at the outset. I'm appreciative to Dan and the RSM team for giving me just a couple of minutes to say hello and good afternoon. And in first order, to say thank you to Dan and to his team who have been great partners to us over a number of years. Debbie, as you may know, was created back in the 50s, created by the governors, legislators, and institutional leaders as a platform for collaboration across the whole of New England, in part to share resources, but also to work on issues of shared concern and shared opportunity. Many of you are familiar with our work and programs. We do a variety of different activities that impact institutions and students. We have a tuition break, interstate tuition exchange, which allows students to move across state borders and access particularly public institutions. Some of you are familiar with our work on state authorization reciprocity across state borders relative to online learning. And our New England Journal of Higher Education is one of the ways that we connect the region to share information and perspectives. John Harney, our executive editor, is here today. We'd love to help share the stories of the good work that you and your institutions are doing, so feel free to reach out to us and share those opportunities as well. Debbie is also known for its convening capacity. This is a great example. I was reviewing in preparation for today's conversation the list of events that we've done since 2008, which, as you know, was the financial downturn and the recession. And On an annual basis, we have done an event related to financial sustainability, new business models, and collaborative models. And many of those have been done in partnership with RSM, so we're, again, very appreciative to them. I want to thank again Dan and his team. I want to thank all of the panelists who are outstanding individuals and colleagues who have shared with you, I think, some of their phenomenal expertise. I want to say thanks to NEVI board members who are here supporting us, and thanks also to the NEVI staff, Marla Phippen and Darren Fulweiler in particular. Maybe you could just give a round of applause to everyone who's been involved in that. We really do appreciate everything that's been done. Before we kick off, I would just note, I think a lot of the conversation that we had in the first panel alluded to this need to acclimate and socialize and educate boards. That is an opportunity for the New England Board of Higher Education to be available to you and to your institutions. We have a fair amount of experience in working with boards and the senior leadership teams to talk with them about issues, challenges, needs, and opportunities. I think some of you may have seen the piece that I had authored around alternatives and strategic alliances and essentially the changing landscape of strategic alliances and collaborations. That can be, of course, a text and conversation starter with you and your boards and your senior leadership. So insofar as that can be a resource to you, please reach out to us and let us know how we can help support or start or nurture the conversation with your institution. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for your involvement, and thanks to all of our participants. And we'll turn the time to Michelle for the next conversation. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. All right, so our next topic is going to be, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Our next topic, we're going to have a panel talking about their actual experiences surrounding the mergers, really from the beginning, the middle, and the end, if there was one. So here today we have Matt Heise from Berklee College of Music, Margaret McKenna, who's the Emeritus President of Lesley College, and Eric Norman, who's the CFO at St. Anselm's College. So I thought how we'd start was to kind of just ask the panel, their individual experience with institutional mergers, and really start with how the conversations began and then how the process went. So to start, we're going to have Eric who's going to walk through a presentation as to his experience.
Ready, set, go?
Go ahead.
All right, thank you. I've so I worked at 4 different institutions. I've done 1 spinoff and 2 mergers, so I'm not sure that it's me, but it feels like I've been. It's on. Is this good? So I feel as if I've been in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the right time. But when you do more than one, you suddenly become an expert, I suppose. And so I'm just going to try to go through the slides quickly just to give you a sense of where the mergers were originated, not out of desperation, but out of really strategic thought process. So, we all read the headlines. Moody's changes their outlook to higher ed to a negative outlook, and talks all about the doom and gloom. You've got inside higher ed, they're talking about half the colleges in the country will be closing in the next 10 years. And where the mergers that I've been part of really came from were more that you're trying to grow. You're in an environment and an industry that it's hard to support growth right now. And so how do you expand your program, how do you ensure sustainability, and also do it in a very strategic way that's a mission-driven area. And so, in the corporate world, you step back, this morning I heard about Sprint and T-Mobile. I'm like, oh, cool, there's going to be a merger, my phone prices will go down, and so I was pretty excited when I heard that. And the same thing when you hear about all these corporate mergers, what does that do for me? It's going to lower my price, increase competition. But for some reason in the higher ed world, the mergers are going to be almost a form of capitulation or a de facto closing. And so some of the more recent transactions may even support that notion. And what I'd say to this group is that the 2 mergers I've been part of were not born out of desperation. We all recognizing it's a competitive, changing landscape, and exploring the strategic alliances is something that's a positive area. So when I got the agenda, I think the agenda played up this whole courtship and marital relationships thing. So my presentation for the next few slides plays off a little bit of marriage, but it is a lot like dating and then ultimately marriage. And so when I say what do we mean by dating, there's different forms of it. We've talked about this earlier today, and I try not to repeat some of the stories from earlier, but it starts from a consortium relationship, whether it's in healthcare or risk management or purchasing. You can get into service level agreements, which is something Mac may talk more about. We did with Berkeley when I was at Boston Conservatory, and we started to do things together, but as separate entities. You start looking at joint programming, often academically. And then I was part of an affiliation with UNH, the law school, into the university, and then ultimately a full merger. And then full integration, all the way in the marriage slide, all the way down in that spectrum is the full merger. And that's when two legal entities become one. And that's when it gets, trust me, far more complicated. So going on with the dating theme here, you know, how do you end up finding a partner? Because it's a process. Again, not born out of desperation, it's a strategic process. But sometimes your partner is the person next door. It had happened with Berkeley and Boston Conservatory. When I say opposites attract, I think Samantha brought up niche schools. I mean, often schools have two distinctly different programs, but when put together, they become a very strong school. In other areas, you have schools that are similar, and it makes sense just to build more of a critical mass. I work now at a Catholic school, and so does that make sense to me to be talking to another Catholic school? It's another niche. I guess I'm a niche CFO. It might. And then, or dating above. So you merge into a university because they have bigger programs, more financial strength. And so you can kind of go through the list. And these categories aren't mutually exclusive, but you know, your partner will often be someone that you've been bumping into, someone that you've been playing well in the sandbox with historically, you've done other transactions with. It's hard to start from 0 to 60 miles an hour. I think one of the important parts we'll talk probably more about is understanding both sets of motivations. Is the merger coming from a strategic standpoint, a stress standpoint? You guys see synergies together. What are the things that are really driving this from both sides? And if both sides are looking at doing an honest assessment of their strengths, you know, hopefully you can see benefit to that. The next few slides I'll go through quickly. You know, why should we consider dating? Mac and I, by just full disclosure, we did a presentation. There's some borrowing most of our slides, so thank you, Mac, for you probably wrote half of these, if not more. You know, academic program is where it starts, right? And that's one of the mergers that I did at the UNH Law School. The primary focus was on growing programs, joint degrees, 3x3s, using the expertise of one discipline in order to enhance the others. Looking at faculty who have a completely different set of expertise and skills, or even creating a pipeline. And that could be an undergraduate school that feeds a law school. That could be a community college that feeds an undergrad school. There's ways to use your merged entity as a feeder school. One of the things we realized was that at the Big Ten schools, they all have law schools. Well, 35 or 40% of the law students in each law school come from the undergraduate school. So they're a perfect feeder school. So why not connect those? Things like rankings are another thing. The U.S. News and World Report rankings, those matter. Those drive admissions, particularly in the undergraduate schools. We learned at the law school world that every year Princeton and MIT get ranked in the top 10 for law schools. Well, they don't have law schools, but the reality is they have a great reputation, and so everybody thinks they have law schools. So why not leverage off of that? Then there's non-programmatic reasons to do it. And again, improving your market position, improving your brand, ensuring that the synergies and savings that might be out there are realized. That's part of the negotiations and part of structuring the deal. And then at the end of the day, make sure there's a strong shared vision of what are the must-haves that both sides agree to, because that's key, and it has to be done up front. That's 2 slides. Better make sure you have an open mind for dating, so that's someone looking in the mirror if it's not obvious. It really is, for me, it emerged twice by doing a SWOT. It was looking at internally where are the holes and where are the strengths, and then how do you improve upon that. And so often it's the internal self-assessment that drives the merger conversation. And you really do need an internal champion, whether it's the CFOs, the president, someone on the board. There needs to be a group of people that latch onto the idea and help the internal champions, because there will be opposition coming from all ranks and files, places you could never expect them. So if you don't have the people that are working on it day to day, if you don't have that committee structure set up to ensure that there's a review, you need someone looking at the landscape. And then you've got constituent management, where there's going to be an alum who's upset, there's going to be a group of trustees who are upset, there's going to be a donor who's upset. And so how do you fight through that to continue to move forward. And my last slide is time to get in shape, right? And so you want to be a good merger partner. You could say putting pig on the lipstick, but that's not the right term. The right term is you want to be a strong partner. You want to go into merger discussions and understand your fiscal strengths, understand, and the partner also is going to do due diligence on you. So both sides are going to have to understand what they're getting into, and all the way from the fiscal strength, the physical plan, online capabilities, campuses in other countries, all things that help study abroad programs, and then student demand. What's your market position with the students? What's the cost of attendance? And those are all factors in becoming a strong merger partner, because ultimately, if you're not a strong partner, you're going to find yourself behind in negotiations. That's my view from 10,000 feet.
Okay, so just a few facts on Berkeley. Prior to our merger with the Boston Conservatory, Berkeley was considered the global leader in contemporary music education. And then with the combination of the Boston Conservatory, we're now aspiring to global leadership in performing arts education. So we've got excellent programs now, not only in music, but dance and theater, especially musical theater. We have a global student body of over 6,700 students, or a pretty significant size. As you can see on the slide, come from about 100 different countries. And we have locations in Boston, New York City, and Valencia, Spain, which, by the way, is a great place to visit if you ever had the chance. It's a beautiful place. We also have a very successful online education program, and this is not only a strategic strength for Berkeley, but also a strategic priority. I think we've had a couple of comments about online education. Not only does it open up our target audience to a much broader demographic. So for instance, our online students range from kids in their early teens to lifelong learners in their 80s. So it goes way beyond the traditional college demographic of 18 to 21 years old. But it's also incredibly affordable. The cost of an online degree at Berkeley is about 40% of the cost of the on-campus degree. So very affordable. And we've got a bunch of accomplished alumni. You may have heard of some of them, like Quincy Jones, John Mayer, Amy Mann, Alex Lacamoire. So it's a lot of famous people. So that's kind of an interesting thing to work with. Okay, so now on to our merger with the Boston Conservatory. This was one of the most important events in our history. And it was an incredibly complex process that took nearly 2 years to get put in place. So I've tried to distill the 2 years down into 6 building blocks on 2 slides. So let's see how we do on this. First, apropos of the conversation before, finances are always a consideration in any merger. But in our case, the fundamental driver was strategic. And as I said before, it offered the combined institution an opportunity for leadership in performing arts education that neither one of the 2 institutions could have pursued on its own without an incredible investment in time and money. So there's really, and I think a few people mentioned this, both sides have to benefit from a merger. It can't be just one over the other, especially in higher education. So, developing a shared strategic version was the first step in our merger discussions and merger consideration. And developing a shared version, a shared strategic vision that our entire community could buy into. So that was critical. From there, we assessed competitive positioning, and Eric mentioned a couple of these things. But what is the target audience for the combined institution? It could be the same, or it could be very different, or there could be just important overlaps from the 2 individual institutions. And then conducting a traditional SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, as you do that, and then focusing on opportunity assessment. What are the opportunities for the combined institution? Academic, that can include delivery methods, financial. One thing I would say, and I hope comes out in our discussion, is that There's always a tendency to overestimate the financial benefits in any merger, and ours was not an exception to that. We're still working on that, but again, ours is primarily strategic and not financial. And then you look at the other things, facilities, fundraising. That was an important thing for us because we're bringing in two complementary yet different institutions, each with their own fundraising capabilities, and then looking at what could the combined institution do in terms of fundraising. So all of these things drove the development of a strategic plan and an accompanying financial plan. These were very hard work, but I think it's one of the most important things that you can do in a merger. The reason for that is because our strategic plan and financial plan became a roadmap for how the combined organization was going to operate going forward. This also then facilitated the millions of decisions that you have to make as you become one institution. In our case, we formed 5 different committees to support not only the merger consideration, but also the integration afterwards. Those were academic affairs, student affairs, operations and finances, culture, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then all of these are overseen by an executive steering committee to basically to decide any issues that couldn't be decided in any of the other committees. Designing post-merger governance structure and compliance reporting. So this is this promises made, promises kept thing. Those are critical elements, I think, in any planning of a merger. You have to think about how do you monitor progress against what you hoped to achieve in the merger after the fact. And this includes, we've set up a separate committee of the board, which is just dedicated to looking at realizing the potential of the merger. So we have a new committee of the board, in addition to 8 trustees coming from the conservatory and joining the board of Berkeley. One of the key things there is that knowing what you don't know. And Berkeley historically has been great in music, really knows music well, but we have very little experience in dance or musical theater. So bringing on trustees and leadership who really knew this area was critical, and making sure they were part of the decision-making process going forward was very important. And then finally, as the saying goes, culture eats strategy for lunch. You can do all these great things around strategic planning, financial planning, everything else, and then you can be completely undermined if you haven't gotten the cultural aspects of this right. So we spent a great deal of time and indeed had a separate committee focused just on culture to understand what aspects of the 2 individual cultures should be preserved going forward and which should change. One thing that was decided on and agreed upon very early on is that both institutions agreed that student experience and outcomes were paramount, and that formed really the bedrock of the development of our new vision statement, mission statement, and strategic plan. So with that, I will stop and hand it over to Margaret.
I do not have slides. I'm not a president anymore. I don't have anybody to make my slides, and I don't know how to make them. And I don't intend to learn at this point in my life. So, in terms of my experience of mergers, one of the things taking up a lot of my time right now is I am the vice chair of Beth Israel Medical Center, and I am the point person for the merger with Leahy, Mount Auburn, and Baptist. So I'm doing the governance of that with trustees from Leahy. And this will be not like partners. This will be a system, not a confederation like partners. We have been working on it 6 years. And the stumbling block, so you learn about stumbling blocks, deal breakers, which you should know early on, is who is going to be the CEO. Because there's only going to be one CEO. Not a Mass General CEO and a Brigham CEO, there's one CEO. And we had 2 CEOs. We had to wait till one of the CEOs was old enough to retire, Howard Grant from Leahy, and so he's retiring. And we had tried, like most corporations when you do this, you try to work out a deal, you're the CEO for 2 years and then you become the chairman, and we couldn't make that work. So literally, because the CEO of BI is only 50. So we're gonna wait until he retired. So what's been worked out is Kevin Tabb, who I chaired the search for when I was, was the head of the search committee, he will be the CEO. The chair of the Leahy board will become chair of the system board. So this is sort of like a corporate model in some ways that we're working out. And 6 trustees from Leahy, 6 trustees from BI, 1 from Baptist, 1 from Mount Auburn because they're much smaller. I chair the committee to pick independent trustees. 4 to 6 independent trustees, a different kind of model. How do you turn several places into a new place? By the way, the name of the new place is Newcomb. But if you have $100 million, we will name it after you. So we don't have a name yet for it, but one of the philosophies was, how do you take 4 things and make them into something new, is you bring in independent trustees. So that's one of the things I'm spending a great deal of time at the moment doing. I'll go back to my experience as the president of Leslie University, not college, university. And also tell you that I've spent quite a bit of time talking to other presidents and boards about other mergers since 20 years ago when we first did the first merger at Leslie. 20 years ago, I figured out, 1997. So Leslie University was actually college then, but our largest program was in creative arts and education and art therapy, but we had no studio art. So we were either going to have to build it or find it. So part of a strategic plan was, gee, maybe we could look and see whether or not there's an art college or an art program we could bring in to provide that. That's how that happened. It was a strategic decision. Now, one of the things we learned from that is we had a board member who was a friend of a board member at the Art Institute of Boston who started talking when we had talked about this strategic plan, and those conversations began at the board level. The president of the art college didn't know anything about it. So there were board member discussions and me as the president. That's how that conversation started. So people ask, how does it start? That's how it started. It started with the CEO of Leslie and the board without the CEO of the other college. And it moved down that route some. And then obviously, as we moved down that road, then we included the CEO of the art college, who became then the dean of the art college, which is now the School of Art and Design at Leslie in this beautiful new building on Mass Ave. I don't know what people have seen, it's gorgeous. But it filled a strategic need. Were there problems? There were lots of them, because the salaries were dramatically different in the art college than they were in Leslie University. And the expectations of the faculty were pretty significant in terms of, we are now going to make what they make. The facilities expectations were significant. So there were a lot of issues. Which I'll talk about in a minute. The other 2 we did were also dramatically different. Audubon Expedition Program belonged to the Audubon nonprofit. We were awarding degrees to this program. It was a credit option program. People know what credit option is? If you don't, you should. It's where the nonprofit offers the program and the university gives the credit. In terms of us, we were actually giving the degree in outdoor education, environmental education in this degree, and then we took the program in. So we already had an affiliation. That was not much of an issue. The third one, the Episcopal Divinity School, was a facilities issue. We ran out of space. We condominiumized the Episcopal Divinity School. It was literally condominiumized. And then eventually, Episcopal Divinity School, as you probably know, went out of existence, and we eventually took over more and more of it. So 3 very, very different kinds of approaches, different kinds of needs, all met a strategic need. So several lessons learned, all differently. Episcopal Divinity School dealt with the president of the Episcopal Divinity School and found out that the board, he was way out ahead of his skis. went way down that path and then found out that the board didn't know what he was doing. And they backed way off. So it was a lesson learned. And out of all of this, a couple lessons I would say is, it is really important to have an honest broker outside your institution involved, who can go to both boards, not the president, an honest broker outside, go to both boards and make sure people really know what's going on. Because you talk to the president says, oh, my board knows everything that's going on. The board knows everything that's going on that the president, through the president's lens. Just like your board knows everything that's going on through your lens. So I think it's very important to have an honest broker who's involved in these discussions as early as you can involve them. Same thing with the medical hospitals that are involved, is bringing in a honest broker from outside early on would have saved us some trouble, some time, and some money early on. Because you have got to find out where the board is and where the administration is. And that's not always easy to do when you're talking to one or the other, because they're not always hearing each other. So an honest broker could be, and the honest broker should really understand who you are and what your strategy is. That's not always a lawyer or a consultant. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I can talk about lawyers, right? Don't let your process be run by the lawyers. The lawyers work for you, you don't work for them. And don't let the consultants run your process. They work for you, you don't work for them. And keep that in mind as you go through this process, because you should know what your goal is. The merger is not an end, it's a means to a strategy. You should know what your goal is, and you should know what the deal breakers are. So are there things that you have to make this deal work? And if they're not there, you won't do it. And you have to keep those in mind, because if you start handing this over to a consultant or handing it over to a lawyer, you may, and not that lawyers are totally necessary, this is very complicated, and consultants are necessary, it's very complicated, but don't lose track of the 3 or 4 things that are absolutely essential to this deal that are important to you. Don't let them get lost in the detail. Very important. I would also say that as you've heard, this does cost money, and you save less than you think you will, no matter what you think. It will cost more, and you will save less. Those are just some lessons learned, but I will say, and we'll talk about it later, is that in the Northeast, there are no more students coming here than there are now, and everybody should be thinking about this. And we are full of small schools in our area. There are many, many, many of us, and we really need to be nimble and entrepreneurial and think about how to work together in ways we have not done before. And if you can't answer the question about why you should come to my place and how your place is distinguished from others, then you're in trouble. And even if you can, and you're very small, then what can you do better to provide a fuller education for the students who come? And that should be key to what all of us are doing. And besides that, there are too many law schools in Boston. So, as you know, I ran Suffolk for about 2 minutes, Suffolk University. And, too many law schools in Boston, don't need them, right? They're all competing, cannibalizing each other. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that we could do that would serve our communities. And the other thing is that the cities and states where we come will benefit by us working together better than us competing with each other. So there's a lot of opportunity here.
Great, thank you. So when we think about just the process in general, I guess one question I have is just how long does the whole process take, or how long did it take? Is it years in the making? Was it a quick process? Can you sort of speak to that?
Ours was about a year and a half, I think, in total, from initial conversation to, and the process had a few steps. One was getting to a memorandum of understanding, then getting to a definitive merger agreement, and then to closing. And so I'd say it's a year and a half or so overall was our process. One thing I would add on this, just to some of the earlier points, about confidentiality, and if, excuse me, that can kill you if the news gets out too early, it can just kill any deal that you're thinking about. On the other hand, you have to balance that with communicating at the right times to the right audiences and making sure you're getting community buy-in. So in our case, we started out with a very small circle of CFO, president, CFO, chairman of the boards. So there's 6 people in all. Getting the right advisor is critical, especially on legal, from a legal standpoint, because these are enormously complex. So we had a very small circle at the beginning, did our preliminary due diligence, got enough into it that we felt like, okay, we are going to move ahead, then began to widen the circle to a small dedicated ad hoc committee of the board, as well as the key leaders of the institution, so provost, student affairs and so forth. And then did some of that work getting up to an MOU, and the president of our faculty union, by the way. And then that led to getting to an MOU, at which time it became public. And then from the time of the MOU, which was in about June or July, to the definitive agreement, which was in December, we really went hard at communicating, socializing, building trust, building familiarity, confidence in the process. And then from the definitive agreement, which was in December, to our closing on June 1st, the work there was on final due diligence, beginning to get organization structure in place and that kind of thing. So I think in general, depending on the size of the merger, it's sort of a 1.5 year, maybe 2 year from initial exploration of the closing.
I'd even add to that, we started dating about a year and a half before that. We'd go to lunch, we'd do service level agreements, we were sharing security, we were sharing bookstore, we had brought our students into their big, beautiful dining hall, we had brought their food service into our cafe. So suddenly you saw Berkeley students with guitars mixing in with conservatory students with saxophones. And that was an unseen, unfamiliar experience. And so suddenly we saw the students really integrated incredibly well. I think that was the first step that gave us comfort that we can integrate everything else. That the hardest people to integrate are going to be the old, stodgy, middle-aged people. The students, they embraced immediately. They were doing things together the second we pushed them in a room together. And so I think, really it started there.
So you had the relationship well before the merger was
Right.
there. How did the talks of actually merging begin?
I think it's a good point. I think Eric's point about he and I were working together on shared dining services, security, bookstore, and that kind of thing. And we were getting good traction out of that. It was really working very well. As he said, there had always been interaction at the faculty level and also at the student level. So there's a lot of familiarity between the two institutions. And then our president saw that there was some real success there in coming together, and so well.
So it's sweet to make them think it was their idea, right?
But then they said, so then maybe we should talk about a full-blown integration or merger, since we are doing so much together and it's working so well. Why don't we continue that?
I can tell you, when I did the merger with the law school, and Ken Cody's in the room, he was part of it. As the independent law school, we wrote a letter to 12 different colleges and universities soliciting ourselves as a potential target for a merger or affiliation. And so we spent our first year and a half negotiating with other colleges and universities that were interested in what would a deal look like. And so we were almost on this M&A tour for a year and a half before we even found a partner. Exactly opposite of what was happening in Berkeley, where we were just basically tripping over each other on a daily basis. And so we aggressively shopped ourselves with the law school, where here it was much more organic.
So when you were shopping yourself, how many how many people responded that they, potentially want to do business?
So of the 12 schools, certain places, I won't say MIT, but MIT said no. Some of the more elite schools said no, but we did get down to a couple private schools, particularly down in Massachusetts. I'll protect the innocent, won't say names, but they were very interested because they saw the need for a law school, particularly one with an intellectual property skill set. They thought they could leverage off of engineering and business and other things. And so we got into some pretty deep talks with 2 schools in Massachusetts. But to Margaret's point, we realized there were so many law schools in Massachusetts that maybe the best thing to do would be protect a monopoly up in New Hampshire. So the University of New Hampshire, who has a strong business school, a strong engineering school, technology transfer, a lot of intellectual property, suddenly our trustees said, no, let's protect our biggest strength, which is actually the monopoly in the state of New Hampshire. And so, so we did walk away from 2 private, and I would prefer the private ones because merging with a public institution, nothing personal, is much more difficult. UNH didn't have its own board, it had a system board, and a lot of the mechanics that we had to go through in terms of the legal negotiation happened at the system level, even though ultimately we were really merging with the University of New Hampshire. And so it made for a much more complicated transaction.
So I think in our other panel, they talked about being flexible in terms of, I guess, roadblocks or wants. Can you guys talk about what roadblocks you had in terms of things that I guess you had to have that were deal breakers, and if some of those changed, and or how you stuck with those deal breakers, if you will.
Sure, well, I'll go back to the importance of developing a strategic plan and a financial plan as part of the merger negotiations. It gives you a roadmap and also a reference point later on for how you're doing against what you hope. But it can't be etched in stone. I mean, you're not going to know everything going into it, so it's got to be subject to change and modification as you go forward, which is why we had this separate committee of the board. But some of the things that were very strong points on the part of the conservatory were first and foremost was, will this merger further the mission of the Boston Conservatory? That was their key thing. Are we better off going alone or with you, and will that help develop it? So that was the first, probably first and foremost thing from the conservatory board and president. Second thing, that the brand was very important, but as we talked about it, the brand was very important in and of itself. So it wasn't that, we just have to have this brand in there. It really helped the institution. As I said, Berkeley didn't have a brand name in musical theater or dance, whereas the Boston Conservatory had a wonderful name. So the final name of the institution is the Boston Conservatory at Berkeley. So that brand has been retained and is part of the overall branding strategy. There were a number of other things, I think most importantly, and Eric can amplify on this, but a financial commitment to the furtherance of the conservatory programs. And again, it's a mission-based idea that we have these great programs in dance and theater, and we want those to continue and flourish. And in order to do that, we want to make sure we have the financial backing to support those as they grow and develop. So I think those are some of the key things from Berkeley's standpoint. We were pretty flexible among a number of things, but a few things that were very important to us was, one, getting to financial sustainability over the long term. So even if we invested in the short term and generated operating losses as a result of that, the idea was it had to get to a 2 to 4% target surplus range over time. So that was critical for us. I think supporting the development of online education in some of these other programs was important to us. And I think a commitment to developing new programs that both institutions, students could benefit from or something like that.
And I think to add to that, the requirement that we, Boston Conservatory, had to ask Berkeley to help invest in some of our programs. They needed an investment to help grow and be a sustained program. What that did is that put pressure on the other side of the equation to for cost savings and synergies. And so some of those savings that we got from the merger and synergies were then going to be reinvested in the program. So it was really redirecting resources. And so one of the focuses of the merger was to redirect resources from administration to program. And I think that's ultimately was the key part of the decision for all of us, was that we could do that once we merged.
And I would say that it's very important that 1 and 1 not equal 2. That 1 and 1 has to equal 3. The combination has to allow you to do things you could not do before programmatically. So we were able to add programs that we were not able to have without the merger. So we could now do art education. We couldn't do that before. And an MFA we added, which we could not have done before. So I think it's very important. The same thing we're doing with the hospital. As I think about it, and with all of us, I think as we think about it, is if all you're doing is cost savings, then that's not a reason to do it. It has to enhance who you are and enhance learning for your students to go through the, I'll tell you, pain of doing it. And I think one of the things we had to overcome at Leslie was that the art students thought they were going to move to the suburbs of Cambridge. Because they were in downtown Boston, they thought Cambridge was a suburb. So we had to overcome suburban bias to move to Cambridge. So, and they thought that the Leslie students were too square and straight to hang out with the art students. So we actually started moving students back and forth between classes before the total merger took place, and had our gen ed was going back and forth before. And the time frame was about the same. In fact, it was a little shorter. It was about 16 months from beginning to end. But there, I will say that I think these folks, the 18 months is short. There are a lot of mergers in higher ed that have taken a lot longer. So I think ours, and I think the Boston Conservatory, and I think the time frame I think is a relatively short one. Some of them have taken 3 years or more.
So, what about the cost? So, you've got your own attorneys, you've got your own consultants. At some point, do those become the same consultants? Presumably, when you start this, you separately engage to protect your own self-interest, but at some point, they have to merge, right?
So I worked at the 2 smaller schools, so cost was probably more of a factor for us. We had internal expertise, I think that's part of it. So at the law school, our chair of our board and every board member was a lawyer, for better or worse. And then our chair of our board at the Boston Conservatory was a lawyer. And so immediately brought the expertise in-house. Now we did engage a firm. I used the same firm twice, Nixon Peabody, for both mergers. But instead of immediately defaulting to a third party or a consultant, we spent most of our time internally. And I think that was helpful. So again, you have to ask yourself, do you have the internal expertise and the time? I will tell you that the chairman of both those schools that did the merger discussions and the negotiations and part of the due diligence and all the dinners and all the things that go with it, all the socialization that goes with it, it's a tremendous amount of time. They almost gave up their practice, both of them. And so if you don't have a dedicated group of trustees with an in-house skill set, and you don't have employees who are kind of the internal champions, you really probably need an outside party faster, and whether it's consultants to help with the integration or to help with the different options of ways to put together the merger or the affiliation, it really depends on what your strengths are internally.
Everybody's on their own P&L until you get to closing, then you're one institution in a full merger.
And we did have have a project manager after the closing, and she managed the implementation. There are a lot of people involved, but I'm always someone who believes there's one person who should be accountable, and she was accountable for all of the various teams, where they were and what they were doing. And we took her out of what she was doing. She was the project manager for implementation. That made my life much easier. Because she was, you know, she knew what the status of each different task was. And that was really important. That was her only job.
Can I just add one point on the timing discussion? And I think this was brought up at the last panel, and that is you want to take the appropriate amount of time to do it right, but you also want to keep the pressure on to get to the end, because it is very fatiguing. And one of the most important things you have to watch out for in any merger is the wear and tear on people in your organization. Almost everybody on the staff side has to continue doing their day job as well as handle this merger. And so if they don't see progress, they feel like it's going to go on forever. Then you have burnout and people leaving, especially, and the people you don't want to leave are the ones who are going to leave. So it's critical to take the right amount of time, but balance that with very firm interim deadlines. We had a very specific deadline for getting to an MOU. We had a very specific deadline for a definitive agreement, and then we had a very specific deadline for closing. And in between those key milestones, we were flexible. You know, things could give and take depending on you know, circumstances dictated. But you have to have very visible set time or milestones.
We found that, you know, employees were essentially had two jobs, and so one of the things you have to take off the table for employees is giving them some form of job protection. And so the key employees that you really wanted to be there at the end, we did agreements for the retention agreements essentially, so that if they retained through a certain period of time, they got a certain amount of compensation, that their job was protected, that they knew in the new company they had some role. And so if you don't give those things to your employees as they're working their two jobs for a very stressful situation, they'll be gone. And so protection of key employees is absolutely mission critical if you want some good production.
And how did you manage that with the employees that didn't get that protection and they knew that it existed?
It was difficult because there was a list of employees who got protection and had you know, ongoing commitments from the new organization as to a position with some retention bonus. Then you had another list of people who likely were going to be part of the synergies. And so you had to manage that, and people, again, didn't know which list they were on until ultimately they signed the agreement for the retention. But so there's a lot of angst because people are sitting around making up their own set of facts. And
how did you manage it?
So when I did the law school merger, we basically said everyone will have their job. The merger there was not driven towards cost savings, it was driven towards programmatic development. I would say with the merger that we did here, that was not the case, and there were some very minor, when I say minor, a small handful of job reductions. And so we tried to tell people that virtually everyone will have their job, and even if one person loses their job, that creates a high level of angst. And so that was part of the cultural committee and part of some of these other committees that we had to help manage it down.
We set up a separate bonus pool just for merger-related activities, and everyone across both organizations was eligible to participate in that, and basically anyone who was hands-on on the merger did participate in that bonus program.
And we did a few stay-put bonuses for key people that we really needed to stay, like the head of admissions for the art college, we really needed them to stay. Not only guaranteed them the job, we said, if you stay, you will get a bonus. Because you had to do that, because we couldn't lose them during this process.
Any other questions from the audience before I go back to as part of the process, was there any surprises in terms of stuff you didn't know about the organization that came as a surprise and a potential issue, anything like that?
Yeah, there were a few surprises to me. I think the importance of communication. We thought we had this nailed, and we had a very robust communication plan, you know, on all kinds of levels, and it still wasn't enough. And as Eric mentioned, in the absence of information, people will make it up. It's human nature. So I think that was one of the things that if we, as much as we put into it, I think we would even be doing more of it if we went, if we were to do that again. I think the other thing is the importance of culture, and I mentioned that in my opening comments. It is something that is worthy of a dedicated focus and effort as you go through it. You would be surprised at the things that are incredibly important to an organization that you would not even recognize. So I think soliciting feedback from the entire community, or both communities as they come together, what's really important to you in all of this is another area that I was surprised at how much how much importance there is in that.
Mine's a little more tangible. It was actually systems. We did a lot of due diligence on each other. When suddenly you become one organization, we have to issue financial aid on their system, we have to do payroll on their system, trying to figure out how to merge financial data. And so Berkeley now is in the midst of a migration over to a new ERP system. We had just gotten into one, and so suddenly the alignment of systems and the technology, particularly of the larger host institution, can be mission critical, because the last thing you want to do is merge your data and your systems into an entity that's in process of transition. And so didn't even cross my mind to the due diligence was to really map out systems.
How long did that process take, merging all the data? It was, after everything was signed, you then would begin that process.
There's certain things you have to do.
Yeah.
Payroll has to change. The second you lose your tax ID number, financial aid had to change. I don't think we merged systems on that. But certain things you have to, the rest you can take time. I think it's still ongoing.
Systems are the last piece of our integration, and it won't be done for another year.
I think one of the things is in terms of closing, if you can close at the end of a fiscal year, the end of a calendar year, it makes your life so much easier rather than, deciding March 15th is when we're going to do it. So December 31st or June 30th make a lot more sense. Two things that surprised me were that physically, that I needed to spend more time in Boston, and so did the other senior people from Leslie need to show up and physically be there because the AIB was in Boston and we were in Cambridge. And secondly, that it took no time whatsoever for the AIB trustees to own the whole institution and for the Leslie trustees to own the whole institution. That, it was like in the first year people forgot where they came from. It was one institution. And that surprised me. I figured there were going to be people there. There was one person who sort of held on tightly to the AIB thing, and that person was so uncomfortable after a year, he left. Because everybody else had joined into, it was now our institution. And that surprised me that it took such a short period of time.
Can I just have one point on this? The importance of financial aid and getting that right early on. It takes a lot longer than you think to get through that process, and there are a number of horror stories out there of institutions having to front the financial aid money because they didn't get everything lined up correctly. So if there's one thing that we knew this going in, and we started very early on it, and it still took us right up to the closing. So I would say that's one area really to watch closely.
Well, what about NEASC?
Certainly NEASC plays a role. They came in to both Berkeley and Boston Conservatory as we were in the merger discussions. Ultimately, I believe there was a letter that, I forget the exact terminology, of basically that he felt that the merger would not adversely impact the program.
It's not just NEASC, it's the state because it's your charter, but it, not a big problem to take care of.
But it is important to get to them early on and make them a partner in the process rather than they're just getting informed after the fact. And I would say the same thing with your rating agents. Bring them in early, make sure they understand what's going on. In our merger, it was the first one, I think, where the rating agents actually called it credit positive. Usually what they do is immediately put you on watch. Wait and see how things go and then decide if they're going to take you off. But in our case, they actually gave us a credit positive.
this is just part of the communication stuff. Let people know early on so they're supporting you and they feel like partners rather than notifying them after the fact.
And along the same lines, and you might have gone a little bit further down this road when you were talking cross state lines, but the Attorney General's Office, Division of Public Charities, and particularly, I don't know if you ever had to get into that conversation. We were talking about going across state lines, but
We also got to the Attorney General early on in the process.
Yeah.
And actually, they were one of the easiest parts of this, so like, great, thanks, go ahead, or Seth.
Your attorney will give you a long checklist of authoritative bodies that you have to be in touch with.
So in terms of, I know Margaret, you said that right after the agreements were signed, it was like you were one institution, but, you know, Eric, Mac, how about your experiences? Is it your one institution from day one?
I said the board felt like one institution. I thought, I don't want to, this is under Nirvana. We ran into, we had faculty and student issues, but we worked through them. But the board was a surprise,
Right.
I must say. Yeah.
So I guess in terms of, you know, your, I guess, Eric and Mac, your experiences, but also from a student experience, were students happy? Were they, you know, not so happy?
Yeah, I think students, to Eric's earlier point, they were way ahead of us on this. They were already working with each other, having concerts together, that kind of thing. I think for students, they were looking at a broader opportunity set for their education with more electives, more programs, and that kind of thing. So I think for the students, which is most important, it's a win. One of the complications in our merger is that Berkeley has a unionized faculty, whereas the conservatory did not. So bringing the faculty together into the union and the collective bargaining agreement was a major undertaking over the past year or so in integration. But overall, right now, as we operate today, and we're coming up on our second anniversary since the merger, it's going really well. I think it's going very well. I think people really feel a positive vibe. I mean, there are always things, you know, I can't get into this practice environment. There's always stuff like that goes on. But overall, I think that the institutions have been integrated well. There are always going to be people, as Margaret was saying, who are sort of hankering for the past, but usually they end up self-selecting out. If they're not happy, they're going to leave. But I think the new institution is feeling pretty good.
Yeah, I think the important part of the student life cycle is 4 years or less. Faculty life cycle is forever. So they'll hold on to their identities much longer and much more level of resistance than will students. And students are really why we're doing this. So.
Any questions? More questions from the audience? When would you say the process of merger is finally complete?
Never.
Yeah, there's, you know, if you really can commit to a culture of reviewing the landscape, I think that, you know, one merger may be complete, but there may be another one in front of you, or there may be another way to do business differently. So, I'd like to think that, and I'm not at Berkeley, but I'd like to think you're constantly evaluating new things, and I know that I'm at a new school and I'm constantly looking around, so I don't know that, you know, you may have the transaction complete, but the integration goes on, and the next target still's out there somewhere.
Yeah, I would say the merger integration process itself for us is largely complete. The one remaining area is systems, so that'll take another year. But overall, we really got through probably 90% of the merger integration process in a year. It was a lot of hard work, but again, it goes back to the point I made earlier that you can't burn your staff out, and so you move hard. It's a little painful. There's a lot painful, but the idea is to get as much of it behind you as you can so people can get back to a normal life.
So what are your predictions for over the next 5 years in terms of landscape? You know, what do you see coming?
More of this, I think, for sure. I mean, if you look at the economics, and Eric had a slide about Moody's, but the fundamentals of higher education are such that revenue growth that's based on tuition is going to be constrained, and expense growth in a labor-intensive industry is not going to be as constrained, so you're going to end up with a mismatch, and we're already seeing it out there where expenses are going to grow faster than revenues. And this is an industry issue, and so I think there's going to be, one of the ways you address this is through scale. So I think that's going to be a natural impetus behind further merger explorations.
I think somebody's going to step into the regulatory vacuum, and I don't think we're going to see a Mount Ida again. Maybe we'll see it again, but somebody is going to step in. The problem here with NIAS only tool is to put you on probation and then you die. So that's not the answer. So who's going to do the financial stress test that says it's time for this institution to make a plan, an exit strategy, which is fair to your students and to your employees, and to figure out a way that makes sense. Now, there was something that seemed to make sense, but a different choice was made. So who's going to step into that? Is that the state? The Board of Higher Education doesn't have the authority now? Is that the Attorney General? In what state? In New Hampshire and Rhode Island? Who is that? Something, there's enough brewing here with what happened here with students and employees. Maybe it will blow over. But I suspect that somebody is going to try to do something here to protect the consumers, the students and their families, and to protect employees. And on the other hand, I think that the nimble and the focused will survive. As I said when I was the president of Leslie for 100 years, 22, that we should only do what we do as well or better than anyone else. And when you try to be all things to all